Good day, mates, and welcome to Killers of Nature. Let us pray, where we like to delve into topics of a bit more macabre nature, not quite for the faint of heart, and to be a bit more, shall we say, adventurous than the average bloke, exploring nature's natural predators, the carnivorous animals that hunt and eat on other animals. From true hunters like crocodiles, lions, wolves, and owls to scavengers like hyenas, sharks, eagles, and many others. Almost like Shark Tank. And as a special treat today, with the official pandemic emergency finally terminating itself, and too early for Shark Week, let's take a gander at one of the most intriguing predators, shall we? An invisible enemy whose skills of stealth had been so successful that even its mysterious origins continue to baffle the best minds in the scientific and even the intelligence community is spawning debate, which has fooled us before and may yet in the future fool us yet again, even though just a single strand of RNA, a genome, but anointed in nature with a crown for its conquests, almost predestined to conquer the novel coronavirus and the cause of the disease COVID-19. And yet according to official figures, this wily microscopic creature, measured in nanoparticle units that had in a short span conquered the entire world after bursting on the scene in Asia like a Genghis Khan, had managed to claim even more lives than Adolf Hitler worldwide during the Holocaust in just half the time, and even to persist, apparently, for years after infection, presenting the complexities for treatment providers and patients afflicted with a mysterious condition known as long COVID. Perhaps as pandemic ends, as Plutarch wrote of Alexander, the coronavirus wept because it had no more worlds to conquer. And at least according to Edward C. Holmes, a British evolutionary biologist and biologist, failed to comprehensively investigate the zoonotic origin through collaborative and carefully coordinated studies would leave the world vulnerable to future pandemics arising from the same human activities that have repeatedly put us on a collision course with the novel viruses. Rational people who keep running into things with no brains at all. Quite an odd occurrence in nature. But at least the American President Joe Biden had framed his attack in military terms, putting the nation on a war footing. And that's not just hyperbole. And at least for folks in the military, it was Napoleon who had observed that an army lives on its stomach, a predator. And for predators and the folks who love them the most, rather than explore perhaps intriguing topics about fear and cleavage sites, cytokine storms, or even various treatments, or delve into philosophical existential meanings of what the pandemic might mean. What's really exciting to watch when humans collide in these novel viruses is not so much with how they digest them, but rather what and when they choose to eat and rip them to pieces. So bon appetit, and let us pray. Things may have been a bit scattered in the beginning. When scientists off in China began to notice cases of pneumonia, some suggest may have been as early as November in a hospital, even before the outbreak connected to the wet market in Wuhan. Apparently now being attributed to our old friend and invasive species, the raccoon dog. But by February 2020, after 1,800 teams, or at least 5 epidemiologists that had dispatched to Hubei province, examining 19 times more cases than had yet been even reported in the state. A more refined picture of the appetite for this novel coronavirus began to emerge in our sights. And Bruce Aylward, a veteran epidemiologist and assistant director at the WHO, had determined that most humans who had a run-in with this novel coronavirus appeared to have escaped its deadly plans somehow. Or, as he wrote, most people infected with COVID-19 virus have mild disease and recover. A process called remission in science, not fatal outcomes. escaping sometimes, perhaps even without a scratch. In fact, he reported that in China, approximately 80% of laboratory-confirmed patients had mild to moderate disease, which includes non-pneumonia and pneumonia cases. 13.8%, however, have severe disease, and 6.1% are critical, with the most severe cases resulting in respiratory failure, septic shock, and or multiple organ dysfunction/failure, which is indeed pretty serious and grave. But still, less than 20% even experience severe disease at all after a close encounter of this particular kind, like they possessed some type of natural immunity, supermen, from the most severe outcomes of this deadly encounter by others, favored truly by nature, with no other protection at all. A type of natural immunity, and for those who practice vaccinology, this builds upon what is most often associated with a rather ancient practice, as we know, dating back to Mithridates the Sixth, the king of Pontus in northern Anatolia from 120 to 63 BC, and one of the Roman Republic's most formidable and determined opponents, who so feared being poisoned himself that he regularly ingested small doses of poison, aiming to develop his own type of natural immunity. Mithridatism, therefore, is simply the practice of protecting oneself against a poison by gradually self-administering non-lethal amounts, like the pirate Wesley in the Hollywood film The Princess Bride, in his confrontation against Vizzini with the lethal poison iocane powder. Dr. Aylward says that for step one of the attack, phase one, if you were, getting the virus is a function of coming into contact with the virus, which simply is common sense, going with the chance collision theory. And one hypothesis to explain this anomaly in outcomes is the exposure theory, or one might suggest in an educated guess that at least 80% of those who had been exposed to the virus did not even receive what virologists describe as a viral load in shedding from an infected person, presumptively. And from these early observations, one might reasonably infer that perhaps some persons possess some level of natural immunity, not receiving a sufficient quantum in infectious dose to be infected at all, just simply bouncing off of them. Lucky mates, right? As Darwin would suggest, they had just been favored genetically by nature or providence. Think of this in terms of poisons, which, believe it or not, mates, some people actually believe that viruses are poisons. It says a lot about what they studied in biology. And when venomologists examine poisons, they often utilize the metric of lethal dose to determine the quantum for that potent and lethal mixture. And while it may take only a certain number of milligrams or milliliters of a certain poison or drug to kill a frog or a worm, a larger creature like an elephant would probably require far more. Size matters in poison. It's like a science. And so, who was a less fortunate or least fortunate who wound up on the dinner plate of this novel coronavirus? According to Dr. Aylward, in China, individuals at highest risk for severe disease and death include people aged over 60 and those with underlying conditions such as hypertension, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, chronic respiratory disease, and cancer. The wounded, the elderly. Dinner plates for scavengers. Poor devils. But in the jungle there are no good Samaritans. The strong survive and the weak, shall we say, escape this mortal coil. Game over. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust. It's the circle of life. And at least according to the scientific literature, it was these choices, these very choices in natural selection, that made this virus without one sentient thought stronger than anyone it encountered and killed. And anyone in its way who didn't make the right choice certainly had a chance, but miffed it. Too bad. No crying in baseball. Hasta la vista, baby. Bury the dead, they only stick up the joint. And unfortunately, that is simply the way it is. And has to be when a novel virus launches a surprise attack, spilling over from one reservoir unknown to a human host, unwitting. Not even scientists yet have the ability to get into the mind of the viruses to predict from where these sudden attacks may arise. And if you just happen to be that unlucky fellow, at least you can say that in the first challenge, the first skirmish, you played at least a small part in contributing to the science that others might benefit from your less fortunate experience. But science knows. And science does know at least two things when it comes to highly contagious diseases. And they have developed a number to help them to remember, with so many other complex topics on their minds, especially in a lethal pandemic. A highly contagious disease is going to have a secondary attack rate, or SAR, of at least 60%, like smallpox, or as high as 90%, like the most contagious diseases known to mankind, measles and chickenpox. 90%, which you may or may not know are actually upper respiratory tract infections that are transmitted by entry of the virus into the nose or mouth. Upper respiratory tract. Try to get a picture of that in your mind. You might, or look it up on the internet, you might want to put that little factoid in your safety toolbox, because we may return to that even a little later. Infectious dose and secondary attack rates. Very important terms. Secondary attack rate. In fact, let's just get to it now. In China, they found that the secondary attack rate amongst 55,924 laboratory-confirmed cases was between 0.9% and 4.8%. Or about your chance of winning on a two-number combination at the American roulette table. But over 3 years, and evolving science, at least through observational studies, which do not provide a clear link to causation, only correlation, a better picture of the threat has been refined for vulnerable populations around the entire world. We've had sufficient time to look at this virus we cannot see, except under an electron microscope, and by observation of what it does. And by as early as February 2020, a scientist named Jasper Fok-Wu-Chan and his team had attempted a challenge study with a Syrian hamster, just a rodent, popularly known at the pet stores as the golden hamster, among the most popular choices for small pets, for people who want to watch some little furry creature out sitting around in a cage eating little pellets. And pitting the hamster, they need company. And pitting the hamster, spinning on the wheel in a cage against this novel coronavirus, some scientists decided to sacrifice that hamster, and they determined that at least hamsters have some pretty strong natural immunity still, requiring the successful transmission of between 100,000 and 10 million particles to infect that little pellet. And what are you, mate? A man or a mouse? By June 2020, Suresh Kumar and his team had determined that it took about the same amount of particles to infect transgenic mice and ferrets, but for unknown reasons did not report infectious dose for non-human primates after intranasally inoculating rhesus monkeys and cynomolgus monkeys with live wild virus in a challenge study. As a rule, at least scientists know that, like that threshold of at least 60% in SAR, or secondary attack rate, in case you forgot that acronym already, that a highly contagious disease for humans requires no more than the successful transmission of at most 15 particles. Just a dab will do you. And even the amateur sleuths out hunting for big game in pandemics should know that it should have taken far more to infect a monkey than a mouse. If not, then happy hunting, mates, because this predator has tasted human blood and may want to kill you. Farewell and adieu, ye banished ladies, ye ladies of Spain. Yet, in March of 2022, March 31st, a doctor by the name of Ben Killingsley, had completed finally a study that had begun in 2020 examining only 36 brave volunteers who had live wild virus intranasally inoculated in their nose. And they found, intriguingly, that only half of them, 18 of 36, were able to be infected at all, which is quite an intriguing finding, suggesting again that perhaps some people are superhumans and others less so. And these persons were infected with just 10 particles, making it a highly contagious disease for them, but not for others more favored by nature. But at least as early as February of 2020, and at most by June 2020, we had a very good picture or working hypothesis of who didn't want to have a chance encounter with this nasty fellow. Anyone who definitely was not stronger than a mouse, a ferret, or a hamster, who only had to avoid at least 100,000 particles getting into their mouth or nose. But by the end of the first year of the pandemic in the States, leading the world, over 527,000 Yanks didn't quite adapt under the evolutionary pressure of a lethal pandemic. And according to the American president, that was more fatalities than both world wars, the conflicts in Southeast Asia, and the terror attacks on 9/11 combined. Didn't do the homework, including as many as 73,000 blacks, where race was known, according to Boston University and The Atlantic. Didn't get the memo. Irreplaceable souls. But as the American president said, we all lost something, even though it may have been different. And after this dark period, they will emerge a stronger nation. And under a purely Darwinian analysis, he kept that promise because the strong have survived, and the weak farewell. And who was lunch meat for our stealthy friend, the coronavirus? Besides what is now over 1 million Yanks leading the world, apparently over 90% of those who were elderly, just like in China, and about whom in a 40-page report, even the author had doubted by March 2020 anybody had even read. Dr. Atwood and his investigative team had stated specifically, there are guidelines for elderly care, specifically targeting prevention in individuals and introduction of COVID-19 to nursing homes. Too bad nobody read the report. But in the jungle, it's every man for himself. And if you snooze, you lose, unless you are the hibernating raccoon that evolutionary biologists are convinced caused this whole mess. If you're watching Family Feud and Monday Night Football in a lethal pandemic, mate, when you should be reading the science, that's on you. If somebody had to tell you that in school and you didn't use your reading skills to figure it out for yourself, that's on you. Well, on the big board, it looks like the folks in Africa, despite dire prognostications of doom, did not fare so poorly. But folks in India were not quite so lucky. And according to science reports, their fatality zone began not at age 65, but as young as 45. And, intriguingly, the most vulnerable persons were not men, as they were in most of the world, but rather women, for unknown reasons. So apparently, levels of industrialization were not a key determinant. Just like in China, in Wuhan, it was farmers, not the city folks in the Detroit of China, in the 7th largest city in China, who felt the brunt of this deadly attack. And scientists are still perplexed by this rather bizarre anomaly, since in science the hallmarks are reproducibility and replication. Apparently, however, this novel coronavirus is a connoisseur of ethnic foods, we can certainly say, and across the board, it has feasted down on persons of color, the blacks, the Hispanics, and the Asians, with far less fierceness than against the whites. Or was the virus particularly kind to gay men, finding, just in the States, gay men with a case fatality rate 9 times higher than the national norm of only 1.1%, compared with places like Peru and Mexico, where the case fatality rate got up to only half the rate of gay men in the States. And after a run-in with this fella, not even folks in the Sudan got up to 9%. A population that found almost 1,000 breakthrough infections in June 2021, thinking that they were safe, but taken by surprise. Tragically, empirically, one might suggest that this virus simply did not like them and had a brain to do them in. But they also didn't avoid those deadly collisions. They didn't engage in the due diligence to avoid that confrontation. So let's just say that it is what it is, and leave it right there, right, Yanks? And we follow the science. But perhaps one of the oddest anomalies about this invisible enemy, for which not only the origins but also the infectious dose 3 years into now an ending pandemic emergency remain unknown, as if it had its own intelligence and counterintelligence capability to deny critical information about the threat. The scientists across the pond in the States who had developed with warp speed the amazingly safe and effective vaccines had also suffered the most fatalities in the entire world, still accounting for around 43% of the daily death toll, a 9/11 terror attack every week. They still haven't figured out how to stop it. Even stranger, over 90% of the fatalities were the elderly, about whom Bruce Aylward and his team had said before any vaccines, before any mask mandates, and before any lockdowns that there are guidelines for elderly care specifically targeting prevention in the individuals and introduction of COVID-19 to nursing homes. In a report that even Bruce Aylward had admitted he did not believe anyone had read. In a lethal pandemic. No pressure. But even far more intriguing about what became a partnership between government and science and even media that reported the news of the pandemic every day, letting you know what you had to know, is that while there had been hospital settings outbreaks all over the world, in the States, nosocomial settings outbreaks, as scientists say, were practically non-existent, where public health professionals on the front lines had been prioritized to receive COVID-19 countermeasures first for an infection that statistically they should have known they would not have needed. But perhaps, since pandemics are historically associated with fear, confusion, and despair, they never thought about that particular evidence right in front of their eyes. In fact, the vast majority of the food for this sly coronavirus was found in nursing homes and veterans care facilities where perhaps the doors were left open. Persons over the age of 65 in need of assisted living, unable to fend for themselves, and like our scavenger friends, the hyenas, they were hunted out in veterans care facilities where officials had proactively closed the doors to visitors before a pandemic emergency was even yet declared. Perhaps the novel coronavirus, Citizen Stupid, found the key under the doormat. And even with its origins unknown, at least in our book, this virus, Citizen Stupid, takes the prize for the most successful predator to emerge ever in history of humankind. But if you survive 3 years of attacks and emerging variants, quite empirically, fear is not a factor for you. Be sure to join us next time on Killers of Nature. Let us pray. And in the meantime, happy hunting. Catch you later, mates. This message was approved by Major Mike Webb, Honest.